Developed by Alexander Okias, Loved, released in 2010, is a 2D platformer about abusive relationships, which isn't obvious from the start. When booting up the game, the player is greeted with a gender selection, but the game denies the answer. After being misgendered by the game, an on-screen prompt asks the player if they would like a tutorial. Again, the game denies the response if the player asks for one, and belittles them if they don't. Since the player has only been using the mouse, it's natural to try to move around the small bear creature presented with drags and clicks from the mouse. Nothing happens, the game tells the player they are wrong, and the same even happens with WASD. The arrow keys are the correct way to move the bear around. You can move left, right, and even jump and duck. Loved is likely not anyone's first video game, so these Mario-esque conventions are understandable to most. When the player is met with the first obstacles, the barbs, the game instructs them to jump over them. The player can either listen, or, like I did, disobey. The player will be sent back while being belittled by the game, and I was immediately reminded of the Stanley Parable. But Love takes a dark turn on this concept of an untrustworthy narrator. Through its narrative architecture and multiple endings, Loved emulates the mental turmoil of a verbally abusive relationship. The environment of Loved is black and white, with droning hollow music that is suffocating and fills the player with a sense of loneliness. The oppressive atmosphere draws the attention of the player to the platforming and the narrator. Despite how desolate Loved might feel, the game is very much alive. As the player decides to follow or ignore, the game reacts. Following the narrator's commands will cause the terrain of the game to become more detailed. Depending on which decision you choose to follow, things like the red squares will become clear spikes, grass will be added to certain parts of the floor, and brick patterns will be etched into the wall. At points where the player can disobey, a colorful pattern will spread from the bear, and get more rapid and farther reaching as the player disobeys more. The player's decisions leave scars on the narrator's world, and mark how obedient or disobedient the player has been. The player is continuously judged by the narrator for their decisions, as the narrator wants the player to be submissive, even to the point where they ask them to not hit a checkpoint and demanding that the player should throw themselves into the barbs. One of the most telling moments of the true nature of the narrator is when the player comes to a fork in the road, where the player is told to take the lower path. The lower path is a spike in difficulty, and the player will likely need several attempts to get through. The path of disobeying, which can be returned to upon dying, is easier for the player rather than continuing to take commands. Throughout the narrator's interactions with the player, with the constant judging and feeling of isolation, it is clear that the narrator is trying to verbally control the player, and the game mimics the interactions often found in abusive relationships. Loved keeps track of how much the player listens to the narrator to choose one of two endings. The disobedient ending has the narrator ask the player, "Where will you go? Will you be close to me?" And the player can make the final decision, either to go or to stay. No matter the decision, the player will be placed into a tunnel, with the only thing to do but walk forward. The player is either leaving or following based on whether or not they selected go or close. With the decision made, the game promptly ends with an end card. The obedient ending is different. The player is taken to an open space where they are expected to climb up the hill to the right. The camera pans left and right rapidly to make the player feel uneasy. At the top of the mountain is a coin that when touched brings the player to the same end card as the obedient ending. The coin is worthless, even if the player refreshes the browser and tries to play again, nothing has changed. The coin is not a real prize, even though the player listened to the game and never messed up. The promises of the narrator were hollow. This duality of the tunnel and the mountain imitates the ways a verbally abusive relationship can either be prolonged when choosing to stay or climb the mountain, or severed when the player decides to leave. Loved having multiple endings adds a lot of value to the game and its message. Having the choice to listen or resist allows the player to have agency and play the way they want. In addition, having these choices will have the player thinking about the other half of the game that they didn't see on their first run. Since the game is short, it is not too big of a hassle to play it again, and the endings have different enough of viewpoints to make sure most players don't feel like they've wasted their time. The only danger with this is that there's not much reason to play the game a third time. However, many players might attempt it and be left disappointed when they realize there's only two major endings. From the player's relationship with Loved and its multiple endings, Loved shows a look into the complex emotions of an abusive relationship. The freedom in which the player approaches the narrator's demands and the challenge of the platforming itself allows Loved to succeed both as a provoking story and as a fun game. Unlike some other games,